Morning, gang. Lou here. Just drove Genevieve over to the shop and gonna work on the motor for Diggs's Jeep. So where we left off was the pins for the crankshaft bearings. The previous owner was lacking a couple of the pins, so we got some pins from Ron and we're going to toss those in today, and then we're going to plastigauge right here. We'll plastigauge the main bearings and see how they size up. So stand by. Okay, so pin set on the rear. The little oil port jives. Okay, things to always check. Okay, here's the middle bearing. Got the pin in there. She's all wiped clean with a very thin sheen of oil. And there's my indexing marks pointing towards the front. So we'll drop that in. And she settles right in. Okay. And then make sure that your bolts are clean. So as you can see, I made the little dirt marks on my fingers, so I need to wipe these down, get them all cleaned up, and kind of run the threads clean with a rag so we get the proper torque. Okay, cleaned the threads up. Now we're send these bolts all the way home, but leave them loose. Okay, just finger tight. That main one being a little stubborn. There, it's starting to go. That one needs a little. Okay, the front shell has these thrust faces, and check out the pattern of the oil grooves. So you want to make sure you mate that the same way, because this one will have oil holes. So this one needs to be mated bingo to match. Okay, and then these thrust faces need to be clean along here so you get proper seating. And then we'll measure the crankshaft end play as it bears against these thrust faces. We'll do that in a little bit. Okay, so now we're going to lube it up like we did the other one with a thin film of oil. But we want to get those thrust faces also. Wipe off the excess. Just so you kind of fill the pores of the metal with a little bit of oil. But we don't want to use our assembly lube yet. That's coming up next. Okay, So now we got all the mains in, and then we very carefully tighten them down. All right, but do it gentle and a little bit at a time. And then as you're going, check for smooth crankshaft rotation. So that way you know the bearings are installed correctly and are not binding. And that's one of the reasons why we use that little thin film of oil. Okay, so now we're going to go and torque all the crankshaft bolts down to spec, and then we're going to take it apart, and then we'll do the plastigauge. You don't want to do the plastigauge yet because you're seating the bearing shells in place, and you want to make sure those find their home before you use the plastigauge, or you'll get a false reading. So if you're doing a war Jeep, you need this manual, and that'll tell you about torquing down the main bearings. But also get this book. So this one corrects some of the errors in this one. We'll go into those later. But in this one, in the back, last couple pages here, is the torque specs. So main bearing caps, 65 to 75. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll crank it down and I'll shoot for 70, and but I'll get there gradually. I won't do it all at once. Okay, so you want to be slow and steady on that. Don't just shoot for the full torque right away. And then keep in mind, I'm using a proto click wrench. Okay, so for this to work properly, your final setting, you have to have a little motion of the bolt as you approach torque for it to be accurate. So as you swing the wrench, you know, like let's say I'll have hit 60, so then I set it to 65, and then I pull it, click, it's done. Okay, it's not as accurate going onto a bolt that's already at 65 and clicking again. I mean, it works, but that's not the way these things are designed. So, all right, so we'll start doing that. Okay, so we just torqued them up to 40. Now we'll bump them up another notch here. Okay, now we're shooting for 50. Doesn't take much more. But you can feel a little bit of motion in the bolt, and you want to make sure that you're gripping the wrench at the grip. It's not the same if you grip it up here. Okay, and it needs to be square and level to the bolt. Okay, my engine stand's trying to walk on me. Okay, so we'll bump this up and we'll get it all the way to the spec. Let's jump back to that page again. So main bearing caps 65 to 75, so we're gonna eventually hit 70. Okay, so she's all torqued down. Crank still moves sweet, smooth. Okay, so that's a good sign. Now you can see we have crankshaft in play. We'll deal with that later. That's all part of getting the timing gear on with the correct shims. So that'll be another step in a little bit here. So now I'm going to undo all these and put a little strip of plastigauge in each main bearing. Go through the exact same process, torque it down, but do not turn the crank this way or shove it fore and aft. Just keep it in one position. And yeah, so we will check the plastigauge readings and see what they come out at, and then that way I know that it was machined correctly for the bearing shells that are in there. And if not, at this point in time, you shut it down and you take it right back to your machinist and you let him go through the process, and then he gets you the right shells or remachines or whatever has to be done to correct it. But now is the time to fix any errors if there are any. Okay, so there's a little thin thread of plastigauge, and we're just going to set it right there, and can you see it? Okay, and then I'll put the bearing shell back on, and we'll torque it down just like we did before on all three. Okay, so I went through and I retorqued it all back to spec. She's at, I believe, 71 foot-pounds. And now I'm going to undo the caps. And don't use your torque wrench for taking stuff apart. Use a breaker bar. It's not good for the torque wrench. So I'll pop those off and then we'll inspect the plastigauge. Okay, so I'm going to pull a shell and try to lift it straight up. There's your plastigauge right there and right there, and you can see where it wasn't disturbed. Okay, so now we use their handy dandy little chart right here, and so they've got it repeated over and over and over so I can tear a strip off. So stand by. Okay, by the book, we're supposed to have a running clearance of 0.0003 0.0029. Alright. Okay. So we're tighter than 0.002. And we are close to 0.0015. So, according to the specs, where were we here? Yeah. .0029 to .0003. So we're in the ballpark. So we're okay on that one. So now I'll clean off all the wax off of that in the shell and torque that back together, and I'll inspect the others to make sure they're within spec. Okay, so I pulled all the caps, I cleaned off all the plastigauge. They were all really more like .001, so they're kind of in the middle, and which is good. And then so now, before I permanently install the crank and torque the bearings down, I will go ahead and install that oil galley plug and that oil galley plug. I don't install them until I've checked, because if it does have to go back to the machinist because there's an error, then the whole block gets cleaned again. So don't take anything for granted. Okay, so I'll put those oil galley plugs in. I'll use a little bit of Permatex Type 2 for those. You put them on the threads, not in the hole. If you put it in the hole, the plug pushes a blob of goo into the galleyway. If you put it on the threads of the block push the sealer back up further on the plug, and you can wipe off any excess that squeezes out. And then you don't end up with sealant goobers running around your oil galleyways and finding a home in your bearings. So, okay. So that's the next step. Okay. Now note that this one is a flush slotted one, so it clears the weight on the crankshaft. If you can see that there. There you go. Okay. As opposed to using the standard stick-up type, which can go right there. Okay, tall plug installed. So now we'll lift the crankshaft out. Then we'll slather up the bearings with some of this, top and bottom, or block and crank cap. You can use this. There's some oily ones. I haven't found any real significant difference. The idea is it washes away as soon as you reach oil pressure, and so it's an oil salt, dissolvable grease. So yeah, so that's the next step. Okay, she's all slathered up with build grease, both halves. So now the next step is the rear main seal. Okay, so today we're running a Joe's motor pool, and we're going to give those a whirl. I have not used the Joe's version yet, but I think they'll be just fine. So keep in mind, when you install this, you want to clock it to about 2 o'clock. Do not install it dead flat. Always clock it properly. That will make a huge difference in the way it seals. So it's a little tricky. You might even try a dry run before you put it together. But it looks like a nice seal. Has the metal body to it, and I think they'll probably work out just fine. So we'll put that part together, get the crankshaft set in, put the bearing caps on, and then we'll deal with those later. But while it's all together, then we'll work on the crankshaft end play and get that adjusted. Okay, seal is set. Now before I set the crankshaft in there, let's give it some lube. Okay, crankshaft set in there. Oil seal sitting there. Now we will put some sealer on these faces and up the sides, and then get ready for the dowels that go in the slots there. Okay, getting the rear installed. You can see a little bit of sealer oozing out. I like to wipe off anything going to the engine block and make sure that all the cracks have sealer in it. And but yeah, that's a good sign. That's what you want to see. And then do not cut these nubs off. The oil pan will suppress those. So just leave them stick up. Okay, so I put in the caps, and now I'm going back through the torque procedure. You don't want to just torque the rear one all the way without the front ones in place, and you want to bring them all in at the same time. Okay, don't forget to zero out your torque wrench when you're done using it. So they're all in. Spins nice. Hopefully that'll do the trick. Okay, so now next step is crankshaft end play. Okay, here's the shim that it had. So we'll go ahead and use that again. Goes right there. Okay. Then we got a new gear, and here's the old gear. They're both in pretty good shape. I like the old one better though, because it is machined with puller holes, which is very handy, and the teeth show like nowhere. So I bet you this was probably new to the rebuild last time. So I think we'll recycle this one and just park this one on the shelf. Yeah, it's just not as nice. Timing gear index mark. So I'll take time out and clean this one up real good and inspect it very carefully. Yeah, cleaned up very nice. There's even still machining marks in the thrust faces of the gear teeth that haven't polished all the way out. This runs against a fiber cam gear, so these very rarely wear out. The culprit to these is rust from a improperly stored motor. But yeah, with the puller holes on it, makes it so much nicer. So we're going to run this one, and I think she'll perform beautifully. Okay, here's the thrust washer. So that real fine machined face goes against the engine, and this face goes against the cam gear. So that'll just shove on there like that. But I want to lubricate that thrust face with some build grease first. Okay, so that's on there with some build grease, turning nice and smooth. That shim is in between, giving us a little bit of end play. So now we'll mount the timing gear, and it has, show you that, has a woodruff key, goes right here. So that's indexed, and you can't really screw that up. Just don't put it on backwards. So you could goof up and put it on this way, but she goes on that way. Okay, so yeah, let's see here. I don't have a good picture of it for you, but yep, we'll put that together, and then we'll measure crankshaft end play. Okay, my little tool I use, just a piece of steel tubing, nice smooth edges on that end, and gently drive it on with a big rubber mallet, and seat it home there. Okay, normally the little cork seal compresses in there, but I don't put that in yet until I've checked the end play. And end play requires either putting the pulley back on, which pulling the pulleys off, that's how they all get wobbly, because they get bent. So I've got a custom little spacer to go in here, so I can use the crank nut, torque it down the way it's supposed to be, check end play, pop it off. If I need to, I can pull the gear, add more or less shims, and yeah, then I don't damage the pulley. I only put the pulley on once. So I'll show you that in the next video. It's time to go home for lunch. Gotta have your priorities straight, you know. So, alright. So Lou, signing off, and I'll catch you on the next video. Hey, if you need help, join the International Flat Fender Club. Great bunch of folks. And here's the Colorado Patrol, who started it all. And terrific people. They'll help anybody, anytime. So, see ya, Kelly's Curse. Okay. We got the crankshaft is all in. She rotates nicely. Oh, don't forget to put your crankshaft bolts in, because you can't do that after the rear main is in place. And then we press the gear on, which I use this, it's my little tool. Just put it over there. It gives you something to gently tap against, because it's a interference fit. And then we have the thrust washer, and in between there is the spacer that gives us our crankshaft end play. And so then I've got to go find my little spacer I put in here so I can use the crankshaft end bolt or end nut and torque it down, and then I'll put a dial gauge on here and measure crankshaft end play, and then we can adjust the number of shims to get the correct end play. A lot of people forget to do that, and it's worn quite a bit over the years, and so you get a lot of end play, and as a result the crankshaft's moving in and out on your rear main seal, and your rear main seal leaks, and then they think, oh, these whatever type of seal they use, these things leak, they're worthless, blah blah blah, when that's not really the case. It's their crankshafts drifting back and forth. So next video we will measure the crankshaft end play and get that all squared away. But yeah, she turns nice and smooth, no binding, so I think we're good to go.